My presentation is going to cover several items. First of all, I'm going to be giving you some updates on labor market data. Some of it is based on the recent release of census data. So the census represents data from 2016. I'm going to be covering some of the stuff that Catherine did, but I'm going to shorten that portion of it. Catherine's numbers were up to 2018 because her data is relying on labor force survey data. And I'm going to talk about some of the differences, but I think what's reassuring is that there's a lot of commonality in terms of some of the items that she highlighted in terms of growth sectors, significant sectors, and so on. I'm also I will do some labor force survey data, but just talking about broad unemployment trends and participation trends. And then I want to bring up a few other pieces of data. We have commuting data I want to introduce to you from the census, and also Canadian business counts. So Canadian business counts is a Statistics Canada census of establishments, so it's employers. And the number of employers don't always correspond directly with number of jobs, because some sectors have a very large number of solo operators or small businesses. So I want to highlight some of those concentrations of businesses for you, because so many of you are interacting with employers. So it's good to know, to understand what we talk about when we talk about, for example, small business. Every community I go to always says, our community is really different because we have a lot of small businesses. Every community has a lot of small businesses, okay? So those are some things I just want to point out to you. I want to point out why, because a lot of these small businesses are, they're solo operations. They're accountants, they're real estate agents, tradespeople, and so on. So those distort the figures in terms of how we see who the employers are. Then the second half of the presentation is going to be the Employment Ontario data. So each year we've now been getting data from Employment Ontario on your various programs. So I'm going to profile some of that information. This year, again, there's been some changes in that we have more data. So I'll be able to report on not only employment services and literacy and basic skills. We have some data on apprenticeship, Canada-Ontario Jobs Grant, and some other things. Okay, so a fair bit. Maybe I think the data is boring enough that we'll have to take a break so that you can recover and catch your breath, and then we'll bring you back into maybe we'll take a break before the Employment Ontario data. Okay, so labor force survey data. So this is unemployment rate data. So this is by year. I like looking at this data in longer term trends, okay? So this represents data from 2001 to 2016. Now the reason why it's 16 is that I wanted to get down to the smaller geography level. So I have Simcoe is up there, is the red line. Ontario is the black line. And that turquoise line is a combination of Muskoka and Parry Sound. Now, let me explain this. Labor force survey is a survey, so it's a sample. And the smaller the sample, the less reliable it is, okay, in terms of its representativeness. So what Statistics Canada has done now in terms of providing labor force survey data for smaller geographies is they give an average of 2-year data in order to combine it so it's more robust. So now for all communities in Ontario, like at what's called the census division level, so at the level of a county or a region or a district, we get a 2-year moving average. So instead of getting the data for 2001 and 2002, it's an average of 2001, 2002, then an average of 2002 and 2003, and so on. Okay, so that's what this moving average figure is about. All right, So Ontario trend, you can see it was hovering around 7% at the early part of the 2000s, and then it goes up, right? We all experienced the recession. So it went up considerably, and you can see it kind of went down, but slowly. And it's only now starting to reach the level where unemployment was 16 years ago, all right? The red line, Simcoe, traditionally, Simcoe had an unemployment rate that was somewhat below that of Ontario, also shot up in the same way at the start of the recession in 2008, had a faster decline and has stayed lower. There's been an upswing in the last year or two, okay, but again, it's roughly the same pattern, but still Simcoe has a lower unemployment rate. So then we have Muskoka, Parry Sound. Now Muskoka's combined with Parry Sound because both of them are small communities. In terms of the combined population of Muskoka and Parry Sound, Muskoka makes up around 60% of the total population. I think in terms of the workforce, I'm thinking about the labor force. I think the employed labor force in Muskoka is around 28,000, and I think in Parry Sound it's around 18,000. Whereas in Simcoe it's around 238,000. So Simcoe is almost 10 times, let's say 9 times the labor force of Muskoka. Okay, so there, I can't tell you why the recession had a later impact on Muskoka, Parry Sound, but it did, and their unemployment rate spiked around 2012, 2013, but also came down. Now it could be because it's a smaller sample size that the data is not as accurate, and so you see wilder swings you might see wilder swings in their unemployment rate. Okay, so that's unemployment rate. The other one I just wanted to show you is the participation rate. So that's the number of people who are of working age who are in the labor market. And that means either they're working or they're looking for work. So again, the same colors apply. So let's look at the Ontario figure. So there it's the trend has been, you don't see wild fluctuations, but what you do see over time, ever so slowly, is the participation rate is going down. Now, if we unpack that by males and females, we see it's particularly the male participation rate. Female participation rate is still going up slightly, partly because we still have, we're just reaching the edge of the point where the baby boomers are retiring. So in the baby boom generation, you still had a larger portion of women who had not entered the workforce. Okay, but the younger generation of women, starting in the 60s and 70s and 80s, they started, their participation rate kept on increasing, but it still takes time for theirs to catch up to that of males. But so female participation rates in terms of the 25 and 35-year-olds is around the same as males. But what's been happening is that the males have been dropping more out of the workforce because some of the industries that they tend to where they're overrepresented, particularly in manufacturing, they've seen more job losses, and they've quit the labor market as a result of their challenges. Okay, so the Ontario participation rate slowly decreasing. Also, our population is aging. Okay, so once you start getting into the over 55-year-olds, even though their participation rate is climbing compared to where over 55-year-olds were at 20 or 30 years ago, still it's not enough to increase the overall participation rate. Okay. Now Simcoe, the red line, has had a slightly higher participation rate than that of Ontario, and Muskoka has had a lower one because of the age differences. Simcoe is just a slightly older. Their average age of their resident population is slightly older, so they'll have a lower participation rate. Simcoe had a slightly younger population, and theirs was, and so they had a higher participation rate. But you can see those numbers are all converging over time. Okay, so they're actually almost all the same by 2015, 2016. I would still expect Muskoka's participation rate to be lower. Okay, so again, this might be, see the wild variations in that turquoise line? Again, I think that's partly having to do with just the sample size is so small that it shows far greater fluctuations than the Ontario figures. So I wouldn't put too much weight into that. Okay, the third slide I want to show you on the general trends in the labor market. So we've seen decline in unemployment rates. And so we're starting to feel that things are doing better in terms of our economy. But there's a group who are having significant challenges. So this is the percentage of the unemployed who've been unemployed for 7 weeks or more. So essentially who've been unemployed for half a year or longer. The percentage of all unemployed who've been unemployed a long time. Again, I take the same time frames. Sorry, actually I started in 2006. So you can see the figure was relatively low. It was around, not relatively low, around 15%. Prior to the recession, around 15% of the unemployed were unemployed for half a year or longer. And then when the recession hit, because when a recession hits, it's not so much that there are jobs that are being lost as much as employers stop hiring. Okay? And so the long-term unemployment rate really increased, just shot up. But it really didn't come down very much. So even with the economy improving, that rate stayed high and just started slowly declining, and it's kind of plateaued. So here we are, we're around 10 years, 9 years after the recession, and we're still hovering at around 19 or 20% of our unemployed are now unemployed for half a year. And I think you're probably experiencing, those of you who are providing employment services are seeing this, right? There's a far larger category of your client group who are just not, even though everyone's hiring, they're having challenges, okay? And there's kind of something that's changed in the labor market in terms of who employers are hiring, how they're judging, what kind of skills they expect to have from these individuals, okay? And it includes soft skills and all those things that you're familiar with. But I think it's interesting that as we're kind of celebrating the fact that our economy is definitely improving, there is certainly a category of people who are not benefiting from this upswing in the employment. Okay. So now the census data. So the first thing I'm going to look at are the overall what's called place of work. Okay. So when Statistics Canada is looking at work, we look at where people are working. And they identify the three main ones. We have a category for people who work outside of Canada, but that doesn't really, it amounts to a very small percentage. Otherwise, it's either you work at home, you work, or you leave home and you go to a usual place of work, like a factory or a store, or you have no fixed workplace. Okay, so that no fixed workplace, the largest group of workers who fall in that category are construction workers. Okay, so because you go to one site, then you go to another site, then you go to another site. Transport truck drivers, those who have their own rig, who are operating in different places. Actors, sometimes cleaners will fall in that category. Okay, it varies by industry. All right. So here are the figures for Simcoe and Muskoka. And so the percentages. So in Ontario, around 7% of the workforce works at home. And in Muskoka, actually it's a slightly higher percentage than in Simcoe. So around 10% of people in Muskoka work from home. Muskoka also has a much higher percentage of people who work in no fixed workplace, so around 18% compared to provincial average of 11 and Muskoka 14%. Again, that's largely reflected, that's largely driven by the large number of people working in construction. And remember, Catherine was talking about those location quotients, so construction is especially a significant industry in Muskoka, but also in Simcoe. Okay, but the figures aren't wildly different, and overall, around 70 to 80% of us go to a usual place of work. Okay, these are the total figures for industry. So you take Simcoe in terms of the largest proportions of the workforce by industry. So we're looking at industries that have around 10% or more of the workforce. So in Simcoe, it's manufacturing, it's retail trade, and it's healthcare and social assistance. Okay, and construction comes very close. It's 9.7. Okay, so those are the four biggies. Okay. Similarly, in terms of growth, those were also, apart from manufacturing did not have as significant growth, but it still had growth. Manufacturing has been growing in Simcoe. But construction, retail trade, and healthcare and social assistance, significant growth as well. Okay. Now, question was asked whether these are part-time, full-time. These include part-time and full-time. So, so the retail trade numbers include part-time figures. So it kind of inflates the real employment because we're not talking about equivalent jobs here. One or two things I will point out. Yes, also, the arts and entertainment and recreation has a higher location quotient in Simcoe. Okay. But it still only represents around 3% or so of the employment, and as Catherine was mentioning, highly seasonal, because we're talking about ski hills, marinas, and so on. So a lot of those operations, are only working for 6 or 8 months of the year at most. Okay. The other one I'm going to just draw attention to is administrative and support. That includes various services to buildings, so cleaners, landscaping services. It also includes call centers and temp agencies. And it always worries me a bit when I see that number increase, okay? Because it suggests to me that some issues around quality of the job or how precarious the job is. So in Simcoe and in Muskoka, those numbers have increased. In fact, like the number of people working in that sector has increased around 20% in the census. Yeah, and so for Muskoka, there are quite a few similarities between Simcoe and Muskoka, but Muskoka certainly has a much smaller manufacturing sector compared to Simcoe, and definitely, and construction is much higher, and I think Catherine's right. A lot of it has to do with not so much residential construction, but the construction around vacation properties. Same thing with the retail trade. She identified as having a high location quotient, and partly that's all. Again, it's all wrapped up with the tourism trade. Okay, so there's no particular reason for you to have more grocery stores or clothing stores or liquor store. Well, maybe liquor stores here. That by reason of the population. It's because there's people who are coming here and buying that stuff. They're not buying it at home. So you're always going to have, so long as your tourism industry is going to be high, it's not only having an impact on food and accommodation services and arts, entertainment and recreation sector, which are our traditional tourism sector. It's reflected in your retail trade numbers as well. okay? But it also means that if you are dependent on that kind of industry, then you've got the challenge of the seasonality, which I think is a real barrier in terms of trying to promote that as an attractive career opportunity because of the time frames, right, in terms of being able to perhaps only work for 8 months of the year. Okay, the census data also gives us a level of educational attainment. So this is a comparison of levels of educational attainment by 5 categories of education. We have no certificate, high school diploma, apprenticeship, college, or university. Okay, 5 pretty easy categories. And this data has been broken down by age groups. So youth, 15 to 24-year-olds, 25 to 44-year-olds, and 45 to 64-year-olds. I wanted to just focus on the working age populations. This represents all residents, not only employed residents. So every resident in that age group, what's the percentage breakdown by these different categories? And I've put the Ontario figures and compared them to the Simcoe and Muskoka figures. And I have 2016 compared to 2011. Okay? So just to point out a few things here. And I'm going to start with the 45 to 64-year-olds. So what we're seeing there, many of those people are people who probably grew up in, well, good chance they grew up in Simcoe or Muskoka. And it represents what the choices they made around 20 to 30 years ago in terms of their education. Okay. So by and large, there are not great differences between the Simcoe and Muskoka populations and the Ontario averages, except in the areas, when you look at the post-secondary education, far higher levels of college diplomas than university diplomas. Okay, so for example, in 2016 in Ontario, 29% of that age group had a university degree. Whereas in Simcoe it's 19%, in Muskoka, 17%, in Muskoka it's 19%. Whereas a college certificate is the other way around. You've got around 24% of Ontarians with a college diploma, and in Muskoka it's 28%, and Muskoka 26%. Higher numbers of people, slightly higher numbers of people with only a high school diploma in this area compared to the Ontario average, and also just almost the same amount who have no high school diploma, so high school dropouts. It's only around 13 or 14%. So Toronto in particular drives the university figures. Toronto has a very, very high proportion of people with university degrees, and it's really like Simcoe and Muskoka really represent very much what it looks like in the rest of Ontario. Okay? Probably the better way to make comparisons is not to make comparisons to the Ontario numbers, because they're distorted by the Toronto numbers. And by the Toronto numbers, I'll include like kind of the entire Toronto CMA, so not just the city of Toronto. I'll tell you, for example, on that Halton, of its adult population, something like 70% have either a university degree or a college diploma. It's an astonishingly high number. And Peel has around 44%, I think, of their population has a university degree. Okay, really high. Many of those are degrees that were obtained outside Canada. It's also being driven by the newcomer numbers. But that's another story, and actually I will talk about that when we talk about the Employment Ontario figures. But as we go through these age categories, the other thing I'm going to mention to you is that we've been talking about how we've been emphasizing encouraging people to stay in school longer, and certainly the figures for 25 to 44-year-olds, we see they have a higher educational attainment rate than the generation that went before. Okay? Okay, so just on the Ontario figures, around 40% of them have a university degree compared to 29% of that older generation. And similarly, like the Simcoe and Muskoka figures, they're around 5% higher. Okay? But what's happening when we look at these figures is that we seem to also be plateauing. We seem to be reaching, like the level to which people are staying in school longer, we're probably reaching now the limit. I'm just looking at these figures. I think we probably is going to be a hard time encouraging people to take on post-secondary. You know, you have to know that in Canada we have the highest percentage of people with post-secondary degrees in the world. We're higher than any other country, and yet we still say we need to send more people to school, even though we don't have jobs that require university degrees for them. Okay, well, this is a real problem. And I give credit to our youth because they're now figuring this out. So number one, they are not going to university in the same numbers they used to. More of them are taking up college diplomas, and that's reflected in the figures. But apprenticeship numbers aren't doing as well. Now it may be because generally skilled trades and construction is not as an attractive option, but it certainly should be and can be in these communities where construction is still high. But in any case, that would be the story from this slide, I would say to you, is that I think it's not that it's not still increasing, but the rate of increase is slowing in terms of the going to post-secondary schooling. All right, I just thought I'd throw up a few commuting numbers because it might, and just to illustrate different communities and different commuting patterns. So the way these slides are organized, I take different communities. I'm going to have around 5 or 6 slides, and so in this one we have people commuting from Barrie to, okay, and I list the 3 largest destinations. So here, commuting from Barrie, the top destination is Barrie. 61% of people who leave their home. Okay, so this does not include people who work at home. So anyone who steps out the door and is going to a fixed place of work, not to an unfixed place. So it's got to be a fixed place of work. So 61% of them are going to Barrie. Only 7% are going to Toronto. Okay. You wouldn't think it when you're on the 404, but on the 400, I mean, sorry. But yeah. So actually, I think all those people on the 404 are actually coming from Innisfil and all these other places. It's not as much as it used to, I think. And the other thing is, the other side is like, where are people who are working in Barrie? Where are they coming from? Okay, so commuting to Barrie. So again, Barrie is the biggest source of workers for Barrie. 64% of people who work in Barrie come from Barrie. But here now you've got a different set of where they come from, But again, you can see that they come from a lot of places because the second largest place is Springwater, and that only represents 7%. So it means like almost all these towns all around you, Innisfil, Springwater, Aurelia, and so on, each contribute like less than 10%. Okay? And that's not dissimilar. Yeah, sorry.
Sorry, how do we account for the 61 versus 64% difference of people commuting from Barrie to Barrie or to Barrie from Barrie?
Okay, so it's like this. We would let's say we had 100,000 people in Barrie, and they're all commuting. They're commuting to work. 60,000 of them might be commuting to a job in Barrie. But Barrie may have 100,000 residents, but may only have 90,000 jobs. So the number of jobs that people are commuting to is 90,000. So that 60,000 over 90,000 gives you a different percentage. Like one is the percent of people who are leaving their homes. The other one is the percentage of people who are coming to a job in Barrie. So it's 2 different numbers.
But isn't in the box they're identifying either like in the second box on the right, they're saying they live in Barrie and are commuting to Barrie. That's 60%.
Yeah, but that's a percentage of everyone who's commuting to Barrie. So it's 35,000 over everyone who is commuting to Barrie in a car. So they represent 64% of it, whereas the other one is everyone who's leaving a house in Barrie. That 35,000 is a percentage of a larger figure. Okay, let me give you another example, because I just did a presentation in Milton. So Milton has 45,000 people commuting to a job, but they've only got 30,000 jobs in Milton. Okay, so so those people who are working in Milton represent a much larger percent. Like they're a small percentage, like 28% of people who 28% of people leaving Milton are going to a job in Milton, so leaving their home in Milton. But they represent something like half of the workers in Milton because they have a small employment base. All it is that it's a different percentage because it's a different denominator. The number on the bottom that it's being divided by is a different one. Okay, so Orillia is slightly different. See, Barrie has more jobs. So people commuting from Orillia to Orillia, like, so there's 60% of people in Orillia work in Orillia, and you can see like around 7% of them go to Casinorama in the First Nations. Whereas they represent around half of the jobs in Orillia, and again, they come from different locations. Here, let me just, but here's the thing I'm going to mention to you is this kind of data this is all publicly available. If any of you are looking at your own communities and want to understand better, the commuting patterns, you can ask Susan. Susan can ask me. We can direct you to the tables, and you can find out some interesting information because those patterns I think are important. The other thing I'll say is that it is possible, like if this were an issue, like if what the commuting patterns look like in your communities are of great interest to you, it is possible to purchase pretty interesting data that breaks it down by, what occupations are these people in, what industries are they in, because people are leaving communities for different reasons. Like you might have managers who are leaving Barrie are commuting to Toronto, whereas people are coming to do blue-collar jobs from Springwater into Barrie, and so all those kinds of things I think are part of understanding the labor market dynamics. Yep.
So with the commuting data, you said it's available from other sources.
So we could it's easily the data of all the commuting, like who's commuting from where, like to Barrie or from Barrie, where they're going. That's all publicly available information from Stats Canada. Yeah.
And are they anticipating, because there's going to be a change in the GO system?
Yeah.
A significant change. So I'm not sure, you're probably aware that now we have it where it goes down in the morning and it comes back at night. It's fairly limited service. I think there's 5 trains. And now they're going to have a back and forth train that operates even on the weekends. So are they basing that development, because that's a pretty expensive investment, on the idea that they'll be able to increase the commuting from Barrie to Toronto? Are they?
No, I think what they're hoping is to reduce the number of cars on the 400. So here's the thing. I've made comparisons to commuting patterns going back to 2001, and it is astonishing how these percentages don't change much. Okay, so that it's pretty likely. I didn't check the numbers, but it's pretty likely that 5 years ago, around 60% of Barrie residents were traveling to jobs in Barrie. And and you take like, you know, you look at some communities around Toronto, like Vaughan and Markham, where they have a large number of commuters going to Toronto. And you'd think at some point eventually, you know, that would kind of like, it would change because people get tired of commuting and they'd find work closer to home, and it doesn't. Like the same patterns hold. And so I'm really struck by how entrenched those, because I think what happens, okay, so you know, you move somewhere, you have a job somewhere and you move somewhere else. Well, you don't want to leave that job. You might be, let's say, a manufacturing job. Well, you know, your colleagues are there, your social networks is there, your seniority is there. You get to choose the kind of hours you work. You get preferences in terms of what shifts you get to choose. It's really hard to change jobs just for the commute, but you change it for reasons of, you know, economics. You get a you know, a larger size home. So Milton, I choose Milton as an example because Milton grew by between 2006 and 2011 by around 70%. And then it grew another 30% in the last census. But the commuting patterns are still the same. Like they're you know, like they don't, you know, the jobs are growing in Milton, but we were doing the study on manufacturing because we thought that most of the manufacturing jobs were being filled by people coming from outside. And you know, we have to look at commuting issues. Turns out as many people are leaving Milton to go work in manufacturing somewhere else as there are people coming outside Milton to work in manufacturing in Milton. So all of which is to say is like all this traffic we have is crazy because we're all actually, you know, the person who's, whoever's traveling to go to a, you know, an office job in Toronto, there's someone else coming up the highway going to Barrie to work in a financial sector job.
And that's a very interesting observation that they're trying to reduce traffic because Barrie's been mandated to grow its population exponentially. So what we're experiencing here is a huge amount of high-rise, high-density dwellings going up. So you drive around Barrie anywhere and you will see all these brand new buildings going up for you know, for apartments, condos. And if they don't, like, if they don't commute to Toronto by GO train, they will be on the highway.
Yeah.
That will be a higher percentage of people traveling on the highway.
That's right.
If we don't have the jobs to sustain that, they will be commuting. That is a fact.
Yeah, and what we do have is like we have a very small proportion of people who commute are using public transit. So
But do we have the jobs to sustain that kind of population increase? Because you were saying that, you know, there's only so many jobs here, right?
Yeah.
And that affects the amount of people that will be commuting, right? So these people aren't going to commute. They're looking for in town. We only have so many jobs. Fact is, we only have so many jobs, so they will be commuting. They're going to have to go somewhere else to go work.
Yeah, I think there's a, because I think a lot of
job growth doesn't equal population growth.
Right, like you see, I think people would be moving to Barrie or to some other community, sometimes for a reason because they're coming to a job here, but I think far more often they're coming because of their choice of residence, and they're still keeping the job where they're coming from. So yes, you are growing jobs here, you are getting local residents into jobs, but there's also people moving here who are adding to the commuting issue because they're not leaving the job that they're attached to, wherever they're coming from. But I think things like the GO investment is to just, is to reduce the number of people who are on the highway. Yeah. Okay.
Can I ask a question
Yeah.
while you have that?
Sure.
I missed the years that this is reflected in. I was just wondering if the reference to Innisfil is based on the annexed land in Innisfil or?
Yeah, so this is 2016 data.
Okay, so it
Yeah.
covers, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, anything else? Okay, I won't go into details here, but just again, large portion of people in Collingwood work in Collingwood, 2/3, and then a good chunk work in, 13% work in Blue Mountains. Whereas Wasaga is different. Only around 30% of people who live in Wasaga work in Wasaga because Wasaga doesn't have as many jobs. And a good chunk of them traveled, like 20% of them traveled to Collingwood for work. So Collingwood is more of a employment destination. Midland, again, good chunk of people in Midland traveling to jobs in Midland, but Midland also receives people from Tay and Tiny who are working there. Whereas in Huntsville, again, as you get to a more remote community like Huntsville, you have a larger portion of people who are working there, living there and working there. So 71% of the jobs in Huntsville are filled by people from Huntsville. Okay? But as I said, like if that's of interest to you, that's data that's certainly available. But this is the Canadian business count data. So this is the number of employers present. Okay. Okay. So this represents establishments that have 0 employees. So that means they're a solo operation. And then the columns. So the first column is 0. The next one is 1 to 4 employees, 5 to 9, 10 to 19. Okay, all the way up until 100 or more. So that's at the top, and on the side is by industry. And the things that are highlighted is where for each column, so for whatever that size of industry, number of employees, what are the top 3 industries in terms of the most number of employers in that category. So, for example, if we start off with, this is Simcoe, so companies with 0 employees, so this means solo operations, the 3 largest sectors are construction, real estate, and professional, scientific, and technical services. Okay, so what is that? So construction, it's basically independent contractors, right? It's your plumber, it's your carpenter, okay? Real estate, I used to think that meant real estate agents. Real estate agents is not the largest category in this group. The largest category in this group is landlords. So if you're a landlord and that's your business and you're a solo operator, that's what that figure represents. And it's both residential and commercial. So, but those are separate. Okay, so the largest one is definitely residential. And then the professional, scientific, technical, so that's lawyers, that's accountants, that's engineers, that's consultants, okay? Those are, and again, that's a category, many of whom are working from home as well. They drive the home-based business numbers, okay? So you can see in that the first 2 columns, construction, real estate, and professional, scientific, they kind of drive the numbers. But as you start getting into the mid-range, like if you get companies that are in the size of 5 to 50 or 5 to 100, so construction's still there, manufacturing starts showing up. Again, those are ones that are highlighted. Retail trade now comes into play, okay, because that's where you start getting the larger number of establishments. And in the bottom there, that's where we start seeing healthcare. Shows up a couple of times, so a large hospital, or a large hospital mainly is going to be a big employer here, nursing homes, and accommodation and food services. Okay, so just to describe these, because I know you're going to rush home, download these, and look at them over lunch, dinner, and on the weekend. So, among establishments, 69% of establishments have 0 employees, and 92% of establishments have up to 9 employees. Okay, so remember the thing we said, we are a community, we're mainly small business. Yeah, that's a figure for Ontario. Okay, everyone's small business. But they don't. That's not to say that they represent a major portion of employment. Okay. I think, as it stands, I still think that among larger firms, and if I'm not mistaken, over 100 firms, still around half of employment is among larger firms. But somehow we've gotten to thinking that small business drives employment. In fact, it's not even small business. It's individuals. They don't have employment. Like it's 0 establishments that have 0 employees, but we call them small business. Okay, and now, so this is Simcoe. Now this you will be able to see. Okay, so I'm gonna show you Muskoka. See, like the pattern is almost exactly the same. There's very little difference between the two in terms of where you have the concentrations. Okay, just the big difference is there's more manufacturing firms in Simcoe.